Good evening and welcome to the Orkney International Science Festival online and to this evening's event, Island Journeys and the Mountains Call. It's 100 years since a Scotswoman with a love of Orkney went to teach English in the then recently established University of Ljubljana in modern Slovenia. She was Fanny Copeland, daughter of Scotland's third Astronomer Royal. Her visits to Orkney in the years before World War I led her to her later island-verse drama, The Selkies, and lifelong friends including Ernest, Marwick and Thora, Bain. Translation work at the post-war Versailles conference led to a move to the newly established Yugoslavia, where she wrote lyrically about Slovenia's mountains and made her final ascent to the iconic Triglav when she was almost 87 years old. Tonight, we have two speakers. We have Dr. Matjaž Vidmar of the Royal Observatory of Edinburgh and Dr. Edvard Kobal of the Slovenian Science Foundation to tell the story of Fanny Copeland with scenes of the mountains she loved. So welcome.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction, Heather. And I'm delighted to also welcome here particularly Edvard, who is not only a dear friend, but also chair of a sister society in Slovenia, the Society for Slovenian Scottish Friendship, like we have one here in Scotland for Scottish-Slovenian friendship. And I think it's particularly important that we have this special evening tonight, because in this year we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of Slovenian statehood and independence. So great to have Edvard here.
Welcome both. And just before we start, before I disappear, I should say, if any of our viewers have any questions for our speakers, please enter them into the YouTube live chat, and then there will be an opportunity to come back to them at the end of the presentation. So thank you, and over to yourselves.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you so much to the Orkney International Science Festival, who, of course, again, with this great friendship we have between the two countries and with the two people, we try and help foster that. So indeed, tonight we are talking about Fanny Susan Copeland, a born, well, sort of Scot. She, as we will discuss, got quite a colourful sort of history and also life, but definitely an adopted Slovene, and her journeys between mountains and islands. So Fanny Susan Copeland was born in 1872 in Ireland, at Parsonstown, where her father, an astronomer, Ralph Copeland, worked at the private observatory of Lord Ross. He subsequently moved to Scotland with his family, and here's a picture of the family at Dun Echt Observatory, another private observatory which belonged to the Earl of Crawford up in Aberdeenshire. So later on came his appointment as Astronomer Royal for Scotland at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh, a title that his previous employer, Earl of Crawford, helped to preserve by donating his very treasured and very well-equipped library and archive. And to this day, at the Royal Observatory, we have the Crawford collection, which is one of its kind. Interestingly, in the observatory archives, adjacent to the Crawford collection, is a simple box marked The Buzzing Fly. And inside this box is a copy of the manuscript of Fanny Copeland's unpublished autobiography with the same title. These manuscripts contain a lot of information, descriptions of an idyllic childhood in Aberdeenshire, and stories from her later, much more complicated life. For instance, in 1894, she married an older man, a music teacher and composer, and they had 3 children, moved around a bit to England, later on to Americas, to Canada and the US, but the marriage was not going well, and in 1908, they've actually separated. So by this time she moved to London, and here is really where our story starts, because it's one of the first times she was coming up to Orkney. One of the main attractions, one of the main reasons she was coming up to Orkney is the fact that her sister, Paula, was a doctor in Rossi, and Fanny made sort of several return visits with and without her children. And even later on in life, when she lived in Yugoslavia, present-day Slovenia, she led a Yugoslav visit to the islands, which she documented in Planinski Vestnik, a Slovenian mountaineering magazine, outlining their arrival to Orkney in this way.
In the evening, a group of rocky islands approaches, lots of birds, and a lighthouse, and then more islands. The whole horizon is surrounded by islands, which rise like a green shoulders from the breast of the earth, who lie down to rest underneath this big, serious sea, Orkney.
So we kind of hear the voice of Fanny Copeland herself as she's describing this approach, of course, by ship and straight into Orkney Harbour. And in many of her writing, and particularly in her autobiography, she noted just how similar these islands and their culture are to her later adopted home in Slovenia and in wider Yugoslavia. This is how she said.
Orkney is a mixture of the Mediterranean and the subarctic. Once you leave the harbour at Kirkwall, you are faced by St Magnus Cathedral, built in the style of the Romanesque churches of central Italy. Hedges of fuchsia are common, and in Rousey I saw an avenue of avgave in flower, like of which I have not seen elsewhere except in South Dalmatia. Yet applies will not ripen, at the sea is too cold for enjoyable swim.
Of course, not all of the comparisons are entirely favorable, but she particularly took to various aspects of Orkney culture and Orkney folklore, and she particularly loved the grey seals and used the Orkney word Selkie for them. This is how she described her first encounter with grey seals.
My first view of a grey seal was in the Sound as we were being rowed across for a visit to Einhallow. There is plenty of Selkies about, said our boatman, and if ye will just sing a song, one of them at least is sure to come and listen. Rather doubtfully, I started on Turn Ye to Me, and sure enough a seal, looking exactly like a man swimming, bobbed up and made rings around our boat while the singing lasted.
And of course, when much later, in 1939, she produced a verse drama about Orkney and the islands, she gave it the title of The Selkies, and that is still the most famous of her works in musical works to date. So moving in these musical and literary circles in London, just before the outbreak of Second World War, she was introduced to many people, including Croatian dramatist Srđan Tučić, who was looking for a translator for a play of his. The translation went well, so they worked together, and as it progressed, Fanny, who was already quite interested in the Slavic nations because her father, Ralph Copeland, was a keen Slavophile, learned more about the situation, the current situation of the Slavs in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who wanted to have their own state, of course. And she ended up translating Srđan's very famous book, The Slav Nations, who influenced a lot of the thinking during the First World War around Serbia and the area. But the tensions were building. Of course, it's just before the Second World War. And on June the 28th, the news came of the murder of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo, and the world began to slide into abyss. In fact, Fanny Copeland was actually in Orkney around the days when the Great War started, which she explained in her autobiography.
All the same, I went off to Orkney again to meet the Gileses and the Pirries, to watch Selkies on Einhallow and catch Cutha with the Pirrie boys. And I was in Rousey when the war broke out on August the 14th, 1914. All foreigners had to leave the islands at once.
Of course, that also included Fanny, and quite an eventful journey on a very full steamer down to Aberdeen ensued, and from then on to London. And once she was back in London, well, actually, she first stopped in Edinburgh to console her mother and her sister, who were kind of panicking quite a bit. But then she went down to London, and when in London, she reconnected with a group of people, including Srđan Tučić and others that she was working with before. And she was told that a group was being formed to help the cause for a new country as part of the ensuing war to unite Slavic-speaking nations across the Balkans. So this is a kind of a new Yugoslav committee, and she was employed as a translator and attaché, effective, of sorts. And she was sort of particularly well valued because they needed somebody with the skills and judgment to handle various diplomatic correspondence. And so she was the first perfect fit to the job, very well educated in and also understanding the language. And so the work increased, of course, through the war years. And in the aftermath of the war, she was appointed as a senior secretary as the Yugoslav committee went to Paris for the peace talks at Versailles. The talks were, of course, quite successful for the group, and a new country was born, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Later, she was asked to visit this new country, just about, as was mentioned previously by Heather, just about 100 years ago. And that visit actually quite quickly turned into an offer for a position as a lecturer in English at the newly formed University of Ljubljana. And here I'm delighted to collaborate with Edvard, who's going to tell us more about her work in translations and other sort of literature activities as she was spending most of her life in Slovenia.
Good evening, my dear friends from Scotland and from Slovenia, too, in Ljubljana, in Kirkcaldy, in Elgin, and other places in Scotland, and especially for Orkney. As is mentioned, the Fanny Copeland spent several decades of her very long life in Slovenia. In the first period between 1921 to 1941, she was a teacher, as Matjaž mentioned, in the Faculty of Arts, a new first Slovenian University of Ljubljana. The other things she was deeply interested was translation and adaptation of English authors to Slovenian. In different Slovenian magazines, she published articles of the topics. For example, one of the first topics from 100 years ago, exactly in 1921, she published an article in Ljubljanski zvon, Ljubljana Spell, a monthly magazine for literature and education. She wrote about the translation of some Shakespeare's works, for example, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Macbeth, and the Merchant of Venice of Shakespeare, and made the great Slovenian poet and translator to Otto Župančič. It was the same years of when he was and she was born. So they two young people very understanding this time, not young people in, of course, in 21, but never mind. In this article, Ms. Copeland critically concludes that Otto Župančič that understand William Shakespeare very well, and that he based his translation precisely on the knowledge about this, how to translate Shakespeare especially. So she also did not fail her accent of luck Župančič had then translating Shakespeare as the sort of Renaissance period, had opened the English language to many classical terms of this made a reach that would have otherwise. Due to these changes, Shakespeare managed to become one of the great masters, as we know, a great masters of the expanding vocabulary of the era. As a specialist for languages, Ms. Copeland, that touched upon the Slovenian language too. She emphasized the unspoiled originality and, of course, different form of Shakespeare English, and give value about its sound color and rhythm and other things, rhythm of expression, which was her opinion, all give the translations of Župančič a lot to benefit for. In the free time, Ms. Copeland loved to climb and do alpine skiing in the Slovenian mountains. She climbing some most daring young alpinists of this time, for example, with Mira Marko Debeljak and Edo Držaj. Ms. Copeland made them both enthusiastic to climbing in Scottish mountains too. And as a result, in 1937, Mira Debeljak and Edo Držaj was the first Slovenes who climbed a new road named the Slough Road on the wall of Ben Nevis in Scotland. In the 30s of the 20th century, Ms. Copeland started to publish articles about Slovenian mountains in the British newspapers and magazines. She also wrote a book of her climbing and skiing adventures in the Slovenian Alps titled Beautiful Mountains, which was illustrated by her climbing colleague Edo Držaj, Edo Dozhai was not only a very good climbing mountaineer, but very good artist too. This book, Beautiful Mountains, was published in 90 years ago, so in 1931. Together with Mira de Beljac, Miss Copeland also wrote a short guide to Slovenian Alps, which was published in 1936. In the 30s of the 20th century, Miss Copeland managed to make the British geographers and ethnographers enthusiastic for the explanation of second chain of Slovenian Alps, Kamnik Savinja Alps. During the World War II, Miss Copeland was imprisoned in a camp near Florence in Italy. After Second World War, Miss Copeland first returned to United Kingdom, but the call of Slovenian mountains was so strong that in 1953, she returned to Ljubljana when she started until his death in the end of July 1970. In this second period, between the years 1953 to 1970, she translated various Slovenian literature works into English, the works which was wrote between 50s and 60s of the 20th century, but from the very important Slovenian artists. When Miss Copeland celebrated her 80th birthday in the year 1952, a Slovenian writer and mountaineer, Dr. Ernest published an article in Planinski Vestnik. So this is magazine for the mountaineers, in which he gave her great credit for her contribution to protect Slovenian mountains. Miss Copeland climbed Mount Triglav, Slovenian national symbol, many times in her long life. The first time due in 1923 and the last time in 1960, when she celebrated 88 years. The Slovenians paid tribute to memory of his lady in the great tweet from the United Kingdom with a translation of her book, Beautiful Mountains, in 1985. Miss Copeland wrote an autobiography in the 1956. In his book, she wrote, "The flight only bus, but that doesn't distract from the pleasure she takes in it. Her role in the science was a broker. Her mission in science was to connect Slovenian scientists with British scientists." Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Edward. And as Edward said, she spent the rest of her days in Slovenia, and she's actually buried here in a small village called Dolje, underneath the beautiful mountains that she loved so much. So as Edward has very clearly illustrated, Fanny Susan Copeland left an extensive legacy. In her writings in popular and specialist press, she particularly often wrote of the similarities between the original homeland and her adopted one, so between Scotland and Slovenia. She also served as a sort of unofficial ambassador. Again, Edward already mentioned some of this, but she actually been quite respected by both the governments and the people in both countries alike. And in fact, there's a very famous anecdote that she retells as how she went to warn the British government of the sentiment in Yugoslavia after the very famous Chamberlain peace agreement with Hitler in the late 1930s. So she actually did do some of this government work, which was she finds it quite humorous at times. So observing this closeness between the two places and its people, she recounts a particular anecdote in her autobiography with her usual blend of seriousness and humor. I hope Fanny's still with us. She writes something like this: "To this day, I don't know what brought Sir George McLaren Brown of the Canadian Pacific Railway to Ljubljana in 1922. I met him at Café Zvezda, now, alas, no more in existence." This is actually the park near where Café Zvezda used to be. "He asked me why I'd come here to Slovenia, and I explained that I had been offered a good post and had decided to accept it. I know why you have come here, said Sir George. You have not left Scotland in coming here. Look at these people. They're not foreigners, they're Scots. There are ethical reasons, this is still Fanny writing, there are ethical reasons why the Slovenes would have much in common with the Scots, and here and there with the Irish as well. But at the time of my meeting with Sir George MacLaren, I only knew that I felt at home among the Slovenes, as I had not felt anywhere since I left Danet. So as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of an independent Slovenian state, we would probably like to close with Fanny's poem, Our Mountains, which is actually a prayer, really. And this should be sort of our tribute to the many friendships between Slovenes and Scots, born out of island journeys and mountain calls.
Oh, smile on us again, ye ancient ones, that clasp our country in your strong embrace. Your peaks have caught the glow of million suns. Grant us a mellow autumn's golden grace. Cast off the glooms that mark your discontent, or grey-gowned bounty of life-giving rain. Beneath its load each dripping bough is bent, replenished rivers sink towards the plain. We lift our eyes to you and see the light upon your foreheads shining clear and cold, and we who deemed you gods in days of old, now know you for and earnest of his might, who holds us in your keeping and his own, whose will is writ in everlasting stone.
So thank you very much for your attention. We would very much welcome questions that you can post us on YouTube, but as I said, I think this is an evening of celebration, not only of the life of Fanny Susan Copeland, but of course of the very special friendship between the two nations, and of course the two science festivals. We should highlight that Edvard and Howie work very closely together on several editions of both Slovenian science festivals or Orkney science festivals. And the exchange of scientists and thinkers from both ends of the quite small piece of water that separates us from the continent was sort of very well established and hopefully everlasting, irrespective of borders and other restrictions coming up and down again. So I think that's us. I'm looking forward to hearing more from all of you listening at home.
Thank you both. A fantastic talk, and it's so fascinating to learn more about Fanny Copeland. We have had a couple of questions come in. We've got a question from Rich, and he's asking, do you think it is now time to publish the manuscript?
Okay, this is quite a complicated question. The instinctive question is yes, for various reasons, including legal ones. It will be much easier to publish the manuscript in the very near future, if you like. But there's also a slight no. I've actually read through most of that material, and she was trying to get a publisher, but there's clear some editorial work that needs happening there. So I think more than an autobiography, I think it's very much high time that we have a biography of Fanny Susan Copeland, and hopefully maybe even some of us might actually be tempted to attempt the task. Having said that, I think the time is particularly pertinent because two of her very great friends from Slovenia, and Edvard mentioned one of them, Mira Marko de Belak Držaj, who was a very prominent Slovenian mountaineer. She's recently been the subject of a beautiful biographical documentary, as well as another very famous Slovenian female alpinist, Paula Jesih, who's been a subject of a very nice play. So I think it is really high time that Fanny Susan Copeland joins this group of well, she's treated as a Slovenian climber. In fact, looking over some material for this talk, I came across an extract from a list of Slovenian female climbers in the 1950s, and Fanny Susan Copeland is just listed amongst many other Slovenian climbers. So I think we've taken her for our own, and I think we absolutely the right time that she gets a little bit more recognition. I think in both countries, in fact. I have to say that I've also, with great interest, recently visited the exhibition in the National Library on female Scottish alpinists in the 19th and 18th century as well. And Fanny doesn't really get much of a credit there either. So I think there's a bit of work that we can do on both sides to promote her work and her legacy a lot more, particularly because she was such an interdisciplinary and multifaceted person. She did a lot of work, as Edvard mentioned, in literary circles. So she was great friends with many of the leading literati of the day, and she translated a lot of the work, and she wrote quite a lot of beautiful poems herself, as we've just heard. She was also a very, very kind of keen geographer. She wrote a lot of articles and semi-scientific publications around both Scotland as well as Slovenia and the wider sort of Yugoslavia. And then, of course, finally, as Edvard mentioned at the end, sort of promoter of science, promoter of kind of international dialogue, unofficial diplomat. So I think, yeah, and our biographies, this was a very long-winded answer, but our biography is definitely in order. But I think will require a bit of work, because a life lived so to the full and so complex requires kind of research to piece together all the puzzles and really create the picture of this buzzing fly.
Fascinating, thank you. Well, I've got a bit of a question for you both, really. And obviously we've got this fascinating life of Fanny Copeland, but what was it, that made you both really interested in her and their history? What was it that caught you, to take an interest in this story?
Would you like to go first, Edvard? I've met Fanny through Edvard.
First,
I've met Fanny through Edvard in Orkney. Unfortunately, to say, Fanny Susan Copeland isn't that well known. So the first time I really heard of her, the first time I was at the Orkney International Science Festival, and Edvard with Harvey gave a talk about Fanny Copeland, and I was absolutely fascinated, in particular because as somebody who is, as an astronomer in background and currently working in sort of engineering to do with space and satellite and sort of new technologies to both understand the universe as well as use those tools to understand more about life on Earth. I was absolutely fascinated because of her connection with the observatory and astronomy in particular. But of course, Slovenia, which was, to me, very, very new. I'm also been very, very keen mountaineer, particularly more so when I was slightly younger. But anyways, and so her life is just fascinating, and her manuscript and other of her works actually she's a very gripping author. She kind of sucks you in. There's an awful lot of super interesting things that have been happening in her life, and also she lived at a time that is still of extreme relevance and extreme concern, right? So the pre-First World War, then the interwar period, and then of course the rebuild of a semblance of society after that traumatic experience, and she documented it all, and she documented it with, as I say, a bit of humor, but also an underlying seriousness and an underlying sort of appreciation for different points of view, something that's still quite difficult to achieve if you haven't had an experience like Fanny's, traveling around the world and meeting cultures with an open mind. But I don't know, I suspect Edvard's been looking at her life for a lot longer than I have, so I don't know what your encounters are, Edvard.
Thank you. My mission as a participator from Slovenia to the Orkney Science Festival, which starting in 25 years ago, was to presenting in Orkney some persons who connect Slovenes with Scots, with Scotland. This is very important. So I found one family, Leslie, from the 16th century, who coming to my country and become the noblemen. And this was one of the first presentations, some Scots who lived in Slovenian territory, history in Scotland, in Kirkwall. And this was very interesting because many families, I think that Harvey mentioned me, 8 families with surname starting Leslie, coming to know much more about some predecessors of these families, But this family was a noble one, was a bishop in Ljubljana, for example, and other things. So very important persons, noble persons, were some big properties. And I continue this. Secondly, found something, for example, a few years ago, Humphrey Davy, for example, he's an English lord. Englishman who was a big chemist. But what was very interesting with his connection with Scotland, when he married, the first honeymoon traveling was exactly to the Scotland because his wife becoming from Scotland, for example. So this was enough big reason that I started to prepare this presentation. And the audience was full, approximately 70 or 80 persons coming to this presentation to know what one Slovene wished to take about the Humphrey Davy. I'm a chemist, you know, this is my love to the chemistry too, but never mind to present some people. On the other side, to find some persons who are important to know something much more in Scotland, for example, about Herman Potočnik, visionary of how to traveling to space and stay in space in the space station, for example. I presenting this 2 or 3 times. How it was interesting to present this, you know. Was very important that we find some connections, some glue who exists between Slovenes and Scots. And we do very similar when I invite how another person participates from Scotland, and of course Matjaž Vidmar in the last years, especially to coming to Slovenian Science Festival in the September or in October to presenting something special when was presented from Matjaž about what was happened in the space science and technology, for example, what is new in Edinburgh, for example, about this. And secondly, about when I invite Howie to present something as a big thinker, very deep thinker about history of science or something, what was interesting for us, or never mind what was a few years ago when Howie is talking about Shakespeare, exactly about the Shakespeare, what was connecting glue with Fanny Copeland too, you know. Fanny Copeland was one year in Kirkwall in the presentation of my lecture, that Fanny Copeland was the first non-official ambassador of United Kingdom or Scotland in Slovenia, you know, because she do many things for connections between Slovenes and Scots, especially in the field of the science too, not only about alpine and skiing, you know, what was very important too, but to promote alpine area and protecting zones in the alpine area to internationally. That this is important, that we must preserve mountains, the pure nature for the next generations which will come. And of course, enjoy us, me, or my generation in alpine area, but not only in alpine area, but in any area in Slovenia or in Scotland, in Orkney especially, which is my second homeland, how to say. When in 2009, I becoming all life membership member of Orkney Science Festival, or 2012 when I becoming a member of Faraday Club, for example. This was very nice orders, how to say, for me, and I enjoy to continue my walk, my traveling to Scotland and invite other people, not only to coming to Orkney Science Festival, but we coming with some people who wish to present something what is interesting. And of course, what is very happy that Matjaž is a president of twinning organizations, Scottish Slovenian Society and I Slovenian Scottish Society, and that we work together in Ljubljana or in Edinburgh or in Kirkwall, never mind.
Thank you.
Yes.
Gosh, it's a shame you're not in Orkney with us, but perhaps in another year you can come for a real life visit.
I believe that will be possible next year because, you know, Science Festival is very social event. So we need the direct touch, how to say, between the people, direct communication or dialogue, exchange of ideas, exchange of any information, not only about the science. Science is on the center or the core of the festival, of course, but about this social program in any science festival, which is very important for our souls and our hearts and our heads.
Absolutely. And it's such a good opportunity to make friends, and that just, is great for everything, for science, and, building those connections is really important. Oh, but thank you. We've got a couple more questions from YouTube for you both about Fanny and her life. So we've got a question that's come in asking, do you think that she lived before her time? Would she have been more suited to life now? Was she ahead of her time back then?
I'm not entirely sure she would be happy to be characterized ahead of the time. She didn't, well, she liked, obviously she was, she was a very independent woman, but she did manage to actually carve out a very special life for herself. Like actually, as I mentioned, many other fellow alpinists and very good close friends of hers. So I think, in an interesting way, she was definitely a forebearer of different kind of time, but I don't think she liked all the aspects of the progress. I think one of the things, particularly to do with the mountains, she was a little bit disappointed with how easy it was made for people to actually go up the mountains. So there's little less and less hardship involved, and there was better and better routes, which were so basically become a visit to the mountain becomes more of a tourist sort of activity rather than something that you need to kind of put an effort in. And I think she would have very much enjoyed certain aspects of the freedoms and the ability to travel and to meet people that we enjoy today. But I think she'd be loath about the mountains in particular, and perhaps islands as well, losing some of that inaccessibility that makes it so special once you manage to visit these places.
Thank you. Absolutely. We've got another question just about what we were talking about there, and a question come in asking, do you think Fanny would have approved of the links between these strong links continuing until today of Slovenia and Scotland, and with the Orkney International Science Festival?
Undoubtedly, I think she led several expeditions of Yugoslav geographers and mountaineers as well. I mean, we've mentioned Marko Debelak, the dry climbing, a Slovenian route on the Nevis, and all sorts of other things as well. And she facilitated. She in fact had a 2-year lecturing tour of UK herself. Speaking about effectively what we do at Science Festival here, speaking about the culture and also the scientific and other achievements of Slovenia and of Yugoslavia, of course, at the time. So I think she'd very much enjoy. I mean, there wasn't this format for her to use. Again, I'm not entirely sure she would have entirely appreciated. It was so easy, though. Of course, these days with all the hard work that we all need to put into actually making this still work in the slightly more challenging times, I'm not sure if it's that easy anymore. But anyways, I think she was very, very appreciative of the importance of actually speaking about science, speaking about different cultures in order to build these links. I think she should love the Science Festival, and I'd imagine she'd want to attend and give a talk about a particularly difficult route she's just climbed somewhere up. Probably not on Triglav. Triglav, she did Triglav, but Triglav she wasn't ever the forebearer on various routes, but she did climb some first, well, not quite first approaches, but very early approaches with her friends in various mountains in Slovenia.
Fantastic. I'd have loved to have met her. She sounds brilliant.
Edward, you want to say something as well?
Yes. What is very interesting that Miss Copeland, when starting to climbing, the first time he was in Triglav in 1923. So she was exactly
44.
44, yes.
Yes.
54.
44.
44. Okay. This is relatively old person for starting to climbing, especially to be an alpinist, but never mind. She chose a very young people, approximately young mountaineers in the age 20, 25. This was Mira and Edo, what was mentioned in both presentations. Matjaž talking about, I talking about this. And because was one problem when she starting to climbing, the oldest alpinists say that she is too slow to climbing for example, in the wall, Triglav wall, for example, but the young person have enough nerves and patience that she continue this, and never mind, because she need when starting an hour or 2 hours. But on the end, she was much faster, you know, because this training can many times to be in Triglav or in other peaks of the Alps was very important to training of her, you know. But old lady in great weight was very interesting. Have enough energy to continue, and nobody was in position to say, stop, lady, this is not for you. You know, and of course, this relationship with mountains, between Fanny and mountains, was enough strong that in 1953, she returned from United Kingdom again to Slovenia, you know. And I was very happy because the title who was chosen from Javi, the call of the mountains, is exactly so strong that was she coming again to Slovenia, continued to climbing and translating, and become much more interesting person for the public. And this was important. And maybe some mention why she chose 1953, a communist country, for example, to return in communist country. This country was, before the Second World War, a kingdom, very similar as United Kingdom. This was a kingdom of Yugoslavia. But never mind, she chose this because after 1950, especially 1953, the freedom in Slovenia, in Yugoslavia, this time was changed, become much more liberalistic, you know, was enough that Fanny have a position and to come again to Slovenia, you know, and continue her mission. And I think that this was very important for this lady, and was very important when was as a member, a secretary of Yugoslav committee after the First World War, that she was a secretary and translator, similar in this peace conference in Versailles or in Paris conference. And but her function was only translator and secretary. So maybe not have some special as their flat. Have one question about what was Fanny experiences of Versailles. Did she have any personal reflections? Probably not, because this occupation with to typing, to translating was enough strong. It was very important. She was very precisely, because what you say in the peace conference, you know, must be understood in one way, not in different ways. You know, this was very important that he have enough, how to say, potential of translating about the language and translating. This is in English or in French or language, probably because she was polyglot. She speaks approximately 10 or 12 different languages, similar as her father, Ralph, was the similar polyglot too. So this was in family, and this was important. And after this, because in the approximately 10 years earlier, she was broken. Her marriage, her relationship with the husband who was a composer, and of course, you know, the situation of one lady after the broken of marriage, you know, what they do, probably change atmosphere. And this invitation from some politicians, Yugoslav politicians in the peace conference, especially Trumbic and Slovenian Vošnjak, was enough. And especially, I think the politician Vošnjak from Slovenia said this time to Fanny, Slovenia is very similar with Scotland, you know, it's very similar. It exists mountains, lakes, green and blue is the main colors in the nature. So this approximately alike, Slovenia is alike to Scotland, or Orkney is alike to Slovenia, for example. Of course, we have hills, we have mountains. It's impossible to find the mountains probably in Orkney, but of course in Scotland, yes. As I mentioned, the Nevis and other mountains who are very interesting and very interesting for the mountaineers.
Absolutely. And we can see some mountains behind you. Is that a painting of is that Fanny Copeland? And who painted that?
This picture, that's me. This is my picture. I'm painting this. You know, I prepared this. Yes. I prepared this year 3 pictures, all 3 what was presented in the time when I speaking about the Fanny Copeland in Slovenia are my works. You know, and I continue this to prepare approximately 10 to 15 paints about this and present next year when we celebrate 150th birthday of anniversary of the birth of Fanny Copeland. So this was one of the topics the next year Science Festival here in Slovenia. And on the end this year, we published a book where we some pictures too about the Fanny Copeland. This book was I do jointly with the Harry, and we'll be presenting the lecturers, Harry's lecturers in Slovenia, my lecturers in Kirkwall or in Stromness, in Orkney Science Festival in the last 10 years, exactly between 2009, when it was International Year of Astronomy, and 2019, what was International Year of Periodic Table of periodic, periodic elements. So this will be another, how to say, contribute to this cooperation. And of course, I think that what Latin said, that vivat frescas and continue this to the next generation, the next 25 years, much stronger and much, how to say, interesting for the general public in both parts of the world. And abroad, of course.
Oh, fantastic. I'm really sad that we're coming towards the end really now. We're sort of starting to run over a little bit, but we've got some lovely messages coming in and questions. And I've got a message for you, Edvard, from Bill Graham. And he says he hopes to meet you again in Orkney next year and wishing you all of the best.
Thank you.
We might get Edvard to climb something in Orkney to show that there are some small hills. I'm just kidding. In fact, I need to apologize because actually I've done some math in my head now, and she was actually 54 when she first started climbing in Slovenia. So yeah, so it's never too late. I suppose that, you know, there's many messages I think in Fanny Copeland's life, and I think with next year's anniversary, I think we really should do a good job in highlighting those.
Absolutely. Oh gosh, it's been an absolute pleasure having you both tonight, and I'd just like to thank you both for such a fascinating presentation, and thank you so much to everybody who's been asking questions and commenting. It's been a great evening. So thank you very much to Dr. Matjaž Vidmar and Dr. Edvard Kobal. Thank you.
Thank you.
So for our viewers, the upcoming events, we've got the Science Festival service in the St. Magnus Cathedral Facebook page tomorrow morning at 10 AM, and the event Set Fair for Swona. So we hope you can join us again now. There's the Festival Club on the other channel, so perhaps there's a little bit of time to join in for the end of that. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much for tuning in, and in the meantime, good evening and goodbye.